Stefano was just another quiet kid, not one to attract attention. At 10 years old, he preferred the comfort of his sketchbook over the chaos of the schoolyard. His classmates knew him as the shy boy who always sat at the back of the classroom, observing the world more than participating in it. But when he saw 4-year-old Maria Mendez, the granddaughter of the notorious Godfather Franco, being surrounded by bullies, something inside him shifted. Even though he was smaller and outnumbered, Stefano couldn't just stand by. The bullies didn't know who Maria was. They saw a vulnerable girl they could torment, not realizing her bloodline was feared by the city. Stefano's heart raced as he stepped in between the bullies and Maria, taking hit after hit, his small body bruised and battered in the process. As the last punch landed, Stefano's world changed. He had no idea that Maria's family wasn't just another group of schoolyard parents. They were the Mafia, and Franco's wrath was legendary. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Enjoy the story. By morning, Stefano's life would be intertwined with that of the feared Godfather. Franco wasn't a man who forgot a debt, especially one paid with blood. Stefano was always the quiet one, a 10-year-old boy whose head was often buried in his sketchbook. He preferred the solitude of his drawings to the noise and chaos of the playground. He noticed things others didn't, the way light bounced off the classroom windows, the sound of distant laughter in the hallways. But it was Maria Mendez who caught his attention one fateful afternoon. Maria, only 4 years old, was different from the other kids. Her leather jacket and motorcycle decaled lunchbox set her apart. Stefano noticed how she always sat alone, her sad eyes a mirror of his own loneliness. One day, Maria became the target of schoolyard bullies, and Stefano couldn't look away. When the bullies cornered her, mocking her appearance and her family, Stefano knew he couldn't just watch. He stepped forward, intervening without hesitation, even as he realized the danger of his actions. As the bullies beat him senseless, Stefano's only thought was to protect Maria. What he didn't know was that Maria's grandfather was Franco, the Godfather, and the Mafia's wrath would soon come crashing down on the school. Stefano had no idea that by standing up for Maria, he had just changed his life forever. Stefano had never been one for confrontation. He preferred the quiet corners of the schoolyard, the shade of a tree, where he could sketch the world as it passed him by. But that afternoon, the air seemed to hum with something more than the usual noise. It was a sharp tension that pulled him from his drawings and into the chaos unfolding before him. He had seen her before. Maria Mendez, the girl who never quite fit in. At only 4 years old, she was different, her oversized leather jacket and motorcycle-themed lunchbox setting her apart from the other kids. Stefano couldn't quite place it, but there was something in the way Maria moved that made her seem out of place in a world that demanded conformity. Alone at lunch, alone on the swings, alone, just like him. He understood that solitude, he knew it too well, but today, that solitude was shattered. 3 older boys circled around her, their voices cruel and sharp. Dylan Marsh, the biggest of the group, grabbed Maria's jacket and yanked her backward. "Nice jacket, freak," he sneered. The words stung like a slap. Maria tried to pull away, her small body trembling, but Dylan's grip tightened. His friends snickered, watching with sadistic amusement as Maria stumbled, her lunchbox clattering to the ground. Stefano's heart pounded in his chest. He was too far away to help, yet something about the sight of Maria's fear paralyzed him, urging him to move even as his legs seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. He watched from the edge of the playground, hands clenched tightly around his sketchbook. The bullies' laughter echoed, and the silence around him deepened. He knew that feeling, that vulnerability, but he couldn't stay hidden, not this time. Without thinking, Stefano dropped his book and rushed toward the scene. His feet hit the ground faster than his mind could catch up, driven by an instinct he hadn't known he had. "Leave her alone," he shouted, his voice small but fierce. The bullies stopped and turned, surprised. Dylan's face twisted into a sneer, his eyes narrowing with contempt. "What's this? A little boy wants to play hero?" he taunted. Stefano's heart raced, but he stood tall, trying to keep his voice steady. Before he could say another word, Dylan lunged. The first punch hit Stefano in the chest, knocking the wind from him. He stumbled, but didn't fall. Pain blossomed across his ribs as the next blow came, and the world seemed to blur. He tried to shield himself, but the bullies were relentless. Each hit sent waves of pain through him, his body buckling under the assault. Maria's terrified face was a blur in the background, but through the haze of pain, Stefano could hear her cry, "Stop! Please, stop!" Her voice was small, but it broke through the chaos like a bell. Stefano's world narrowed to the pounding in his ears and the weight of his own breath. Every blow left a mark, but he didn't back down. He wasn't strong enough to stop them, but he was strong enough to endure. For her. When the bullies finally stopped, breathing heavily, Stefano collapsed to his knees. His head spun, and blood dripped from his nose. He barely registered the sound of footsteps approaching, heavy, urgent. Maria stood beside him, her small hand resting on his shoulder, her expression wide-eyed with fear, but also something else. Gratitude. I didn't know what to do, Maria whispered, her voice trembling. Thank you. Stefano's vision blurred, but he managed a weak smile. It's okay, he muttered. But deep down, he knew things would never be the same. Not for him, and not for Maria. What he didn't know was that his small act of courage had already set into motion a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. The evening air was thick with tension as Franco sat alone in his office, the heavy scent of cigar smoke mixing with the faint aroma of expensive leather. His fingers traced the edge of a glass, the ice cubes rattling as he swirled his drink. The world outside was quiet, but Franco was always alert, always listening. The news he had received that afternoon had unsettled him. His granddaughter, Maria, had been in trouble, and a young boy had intervened. He hadn't expected the boy to be a hero. In fact, he hadn't expected much at all, but something about the story piqued his interest. Maria had been targeted by bullies, some insignificant third graders who likely didn't know the weight of her last name. And yet, this boy, Stefano, had stepped in without hesitation. He'd taken a beating to protect her, not for any reward or recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Franco set his glass down, his gaze narrowing as the thought settled. A boy who had no reason to fight, who wasn't even old enough to understand the world he was entering, had chosen to stand up when others turned away. That was rare. That was valuable. And it was something Franco would never forget. He leaned forward, picking up his phone. The network of contacts at his disposal was vast, his influence stretching into every corner of the city and beyond. He needed to act quickly. Stefano's bravery was not just an act of kindness. It was a signal, one that Franco recognized, a signal of loyalty, of courage, and most importantly, of the kind of honor that the world often overlooked. "Get me Marco," Franco said, his voice cold but steady. Within moments, Marco, his right-hand man and trusted advisor, was on the line. "Franco, what is it?" "I need you to do something," Franco said, his voice soft yet commanding. "A boy named Stefano intervened at the school today. He protected my granddaughter from some bullies. He took a beating for her. I want to make sure he's taken care of." Marco didn't need to ask why. He understood Franco's code. "Understood. How do you want to proceed?" Franco paused, his mind working quickly. "Reach out to the right people. Find out where he lives, what his family situation is. I want to ensure that boy knows he's not just a victim. He's a man of honor now. We take care of our own." "Consider it done," Marco replied, his voice laced with a quiet reverence. Franco's word was law, and Marco had learned long ago that when Franco decided to honor someone, the world took notice. The call was made, and soon Marco would have the information Franco needed. Franco leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him as he mulled over the situation. Stefano wasn't the first person to step up for Maria. He was the first who had done so without any fear, without hesitation. The Mafia didn't work on kindness or charity, but Franco was a man of principles, and this boy had shown something he respected deeply. As the evening turned to night, Franco's mind made up. He felt a sense of resolve settle over him. Stefano would be honored, not with money or power, but with something far more valuable: the protection of the Godfather himself. Franco knew that the boy's life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine, and so would the city around him. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when the first motorcycle engine roared to life. One by one, the rumble of the bikes filled the streets, echoing like a warning. By the time the clock struck 8:00 a.m., the school's quiet front lawn was anything but peaceful. The students, who had been trickling in for the day, froze in their tracks, their eyes widening as the unmistakable sound of an approaching mob filled the air. Stefano, still sore from the beating he had taken the day before, stepped into the schoolyard, his heart pounding. He had no idea what was happening, but the tension in the air was thick, something he couldn't shake off. He glanced around, looking for Maria, who was standing a few feet away, her small hands clenched into fists as she looked anxiously at the horizon. Maria, too, felt the weight of it. She had been shaken since the incident, her small body still bruised from the taunts of the bullies. She hadn't told anyone what her grandfather's name meant, but the heavy presence in the air now made it clear. This wasn't a normal day. It was as if the very ground beneath them had shifted, and the fear that had once marked her life had come back. Only this time, it wasn't for her. The school principal, a man who had spent years keeping order with polite smiles and reprimands, stood at the entrance, his hands trembling. From his vantage point, he could see the first of the motorcycles cresting the hill. A fleet of bikes, each one gleaming in the morning light, with riders cloaked in dark leather jackets and patches that spoke of power and dominance. The schoolyard became eerily still, the usual chatter and laughter replaced with the thrum of engines and the soft shuffle of feet. As the motorcycles began to fill the street in front of the school, the principal's pulse quickened. He could feel it. He knew exactly who was behind this. Franco's reputation had spread like wildfire, even to the most sheltered corners of the city. It wasn't just the numbers that terrified him, it was the purpose. This wasn't just a protest, it was a declaration. Marco, standing a few feet behind Franco, watched the scene unfold with a detached intensity. He had seen this countless times before, the fear that gripped the unprepared when Franco's will was made known. The school had failed to protect Maria. They had failed to protect Stefano. And now the Godfather's wrath was a palpable force, one that would not go unnoticed. Franco's eyes scanned the crowd of students, teachers, and parents gathered on the sidewalk, their gazes locked on the spectacle unfolding before them. The sight of hundreds of motorcycles, each one bringing with it a sense of inevitability, was enough to still the hearts of the bravest souls. Franco dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the pavement with purpose. He didn't need to say a word. His presence was enough. The school staff, already on edge, hurriedly moved into position as the mob's presence loomed over them. Teachers whispered among themselves, the weight of what was happening settling in. This was no longer a simple case of bullying or schoolyard justice. It had become a statement, one that the school and its authorities were not equipped to handle. Franco moved toward the school entrance, his eyes never leaving the principal, whose face had gone pale. As he stepped into the building, the air grew heavier. The power of his presence, unspoken but undeniable, was enough to make the walls feel smaller. The principal stood frozen, his mouth dry. In the distance, the last of the motorcycles rolled into place, their engines quieting in unison. The silence that followed was deafening. The message had been sent. It wasn't just Stefano's bravery that mattered anymore. It was the system that had failed him, that had allowed the injustice to happen. Franco was here to make sure that failure was corrected, and no one would leave until it was. The tension in the air thickened as the mob's influence began to settle over the school, like a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. The lines had been drawn, and the consequences of ignoring them were just beginning to unfold. The gymnasium was silent, the air thick with the tension that had been building since the first motorcycle revved its engine that morning. The rows of bleachers were full, but no one was really sitting. Everyone was standing in hushed anticipation, their eyes drawn to the figures who had entered the room. Franco stood at the front, flanked by his most trusted men, their faces hard and unreadable, their presence like a wall of unshakable strength. Behind him, the mob's influence filled the space, not with noise, but with an undeniable weight. Stefano sat in the front row, still nursing the bruises from the day before, his eyes flicking nervously between the rows of students, the teachers, and the men in leather who lined the walls. Maria was beside him, her small hand clutching his, her body tense with the same fear she had carried since the moment the bullies had surrounded her. The boy had protected her. He had done what no one else had, and now, here they were. His actions had brought them all to this moment. At the far end of the room, the school principal, Mr. Harris, stood frozen, his hands shaking as he glanced at Franco. The man didn't need to speak. His presence alone commanded respect, demanding that every eye in the room be fixed on him. The room seemed to hold its breath as Franco stepped forward, his shoes clicking against the floor, every step deliberate and heavy. "I'm Franco Mendez," he began, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that made you listen, whether you wanted to or not. His eyes swept the room, slowly taking in the teachers, the students, the parents, everyone. "You all know who I am, but I'm not here to talk about power. I'm here because of something more important, honor." A murmur passed through the room. The students, who had been standing quietly, shifted uncomfortably. The mob's presence was already unsettling, but the Godfather's words cut through the air with a quiet certainty. He wasn't threatening. They knew what he was capable of. His reputation preceded him, and there was no need to assert anything further. What he said next would carry more weight than any threat ever could. "You see," Franco continued, his gaze landing on the principal, then on the three boys who had caused this mess. "The real problem here isn't that my granddaughter was bullied. It's that you, all of you, stood by and allowed it to happen." He pointed to the bullies, who shrank under his gaze. Dylan Marsh, the leader of the group, was trying his hardest to look unfazed, but his face had paled, the bravado slowly leaking out of him. "You let a boy, this boy, Stefano, take a beating when he should have been protected. And you, adults, who are supposed to protect the innocent, let the monsters thrive. You failed." Franco's voice dropped, thick with a sense of finality. "And now you'll see what happens when the right thing is done." Stefano's heart raced as he felt the eyes of everyone in the room turn toward him, their gaze full of curiosity and disbelief. He was just a boy, but the weight of what had happened, the consequences of his actions, was now something he could barely comprehend. What had started as a simple act of courage had now become a statement, one that would echo far beyond these walls. Franco's voice didn't rise, but it held a power that rattled the air. "You'll make things right, starting with you," he said, pointing at the bullies. "Apologize to this boy, publicly." The room went completely still. Every eye locked on Dylan, whose face had gone pale. He opened his mouth, his lips trembling, but no words came out. His parents, standing in the back, looked ready to speak, to defend their son, but Franco silenced them with a single look. "You're not here to protect him," Franco said, his tone a calm command. "He'll do this on his own, or he'll live with the shame of never truly understanding what it means to be a man." Dylan looked down at Stefano, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. What I did was wrong." The words sounded hollow, forced, but in that moment they were enough. Franco nodded, satisfied, his eyes sweeping the room once more. "This is what accountability looks like," he said, his voice strong. "Not money, not power. Honor. It's something you either have or you don't." The mob's influence had been felt not through violence, but through the undeniable power of protection, of standing up for what was right. The room exhaled as the tension began to dissipate, the weight of Franco's presence lifting. The message was clear. Justice had been served. And as the crowd slowly began to disperse, Stefano realized that the world he had once known, the one where he hid behind his drawings, was no longer his own. He had stepped into a new reality, and Franco, the Godfather, had made sure that nothing would ever be the same. The school bell rang later that day, but it felt like a distant sound, as though Stefano was no longer part of the world that had once felt so familiar. The classroom was quieter than usual, the murmurs of his classmates replaced by nervous glances and hesitant conversations. He sat at his desk, his body still aching from the fight, but it wasn't the physical pain that lingered. It was the weight of what had happened, of what he had done. Maria sat beside him, her eyes full of gratitude, but there was something else there too, an unspoken understanding that their lives had just collided in a way that couldn't be undone. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Her presence was enough to remind him that the world they had known, the safety of their childhoods, had just shifted. Stefano had been prepared for the bullies, for the punches, for the isolation that had always marked his existence. What he hadn't been prepared for was the aftermath, the looks, the whispers, the sudden overwhelming feeling that his actions had set off a chain of events far bigger than anything he had ever imagined. After the confrontation in the gymnasium, when Franco had left with his men, the tension in the school hadn't dissipated. Instead, it seemed to hang in the air, thick and suffocating. The teachers avoided eye contact with him, the students too, as if they were unsure how to act in the presence of someone who had just been connected to a world they feared. It wasn't just the bullies who had been affected. It was the entire school. The power of Franco's Mafia had loomed over them, and Stefano now understood the real cost of courage. It wasn't just the bruises on his body. It was the shift in how the world would see him from now on. He wasn't just a quiet kid anymore. He was the boy who had stepped into the fray, the one who had protected Maria at a cost that was far greater than he'd realized. Franco's presence had left a mark. The school had changed overnight, but so had Stefano's life. He had expected to go back to his quiet corner, to his sketchbooks and daydreams, but now the shadows of the mob seemed to follow him wherever he went. Later that afternoon, Franco's men arrived at his house. Marco, the same man who had been at the school earlier, stepped inside with the calm assurance that came with his position. He wasn't here to ask questions or to offer explanations. He was here to deliver a message. "Franco wants to speak with you," Marco said, his tone casual but firm. "Your bravery hasn't gone unnoticed." Stefano stood frozen for a moment, his heart racing. He knew what that meant. Franco wasn't just offering gratitude. He was offering something much more dangerous. The Godfather's world didn't work in simple thank yous. It operated in loyalty, in debts that had to be repaid, in expectations that came with a price. As the car drove him to Franco's estate, Stefano's mind raced. He wasn't a part of this world. He was a boy, a kid who just wanted to protect someone weaker than himself. But now, the world he had stepped into was one of power, of protection, and of consequences. Franco's mansion stood tall, looming like a fortress, a symbol of the power he wielded. Stefano felt small in its shadow, and yet, as he entered, he knew something had irrevocably changed. This was no longer about the fight at school. It was about something far bigger, an honor, a loyalty, a bond that had been forged in blood. Franco greeted him with a steady gaze, his eyes reflecting the weight of the world that Stefano had just stepped into. "You did well," Franco said, his voice low. "But you should know this, Stefano. In my world, courage like yours means more than just respect. It means you're now part of something bigger than yourself, something that will always have your back. And in that moment, Stefano realized the true cost of his actions. He had stepped into a world where his loyalty would be expected, where protection came with strings attached. He had earned respect, yes, but he had also earned a debt, one that could never be repaid in simple terms. And though the mob's power might offer him safety, it also meant he would never again be just a quiet boy in the corner. He was marked now, and Franco's world would never let him forget it. Stefano's life had changed in ways he couldn't yet fully understand. The days following his meeting with Franco were a blur. But one thing was clear. He was no longer just a quiet, unnoticed boy. The weight of Franco's influence hung over him, the Godfather's presence like a constant shadow, always there, always watching. At first, Stefano tried to keep his distance. He kept to his sketches, his books, the things that had once offered him comfort. But no matter how hard he tried, the world around him was different now. He couldn't walk through the hallways of school without feeling the weight of eyes on him. Some of the kids whispered, others simply stared, their expressions a mix of fear and awe. They didn't understand. They couldn't. But they knew something had changed, and Stefano felt it in every moment. Franco, however, wasn't like the others. He didn't expect Stefano to play the part of a Mafia heir, or to step into a world he wasn't ready for. Instead, Franco's approach was measured, patient. He understood the boy's hesitation. He'd been there once himself. Every meeting with Franco felt like stepping deeper into a world that Stefano could only partially comprehend. The Godfather didn't offer comfort. He offered protection, loyalty, and an unspoken promise that Stefano would never be alone again. It started slowly. At first, Franco sent Marco to check in on Stefano to make sure he was settling into his new reality. Marco was a constant presence, showing up unannounced, his demeanor calm, but his eyes always calculating. He would watch Stefano as he worked, offering subtle advice, guiding him through situations that Stefano didn't know how to navigate. "The world you're stepping into isn't about what's right," Marco would say, his voice low and steady. "It's about what you can protect, and who will protect you in return." Stefano didn't know what to make of that. Protection. What did that mean? What did it cost? The first true test came when one of Franco's associates needed help. A rival gang had made a move, threatening Franco's interests. Marco came to Stefano with an unexpected request. "Franco needs you to help handle this. The choice is yours, but remember, this isn't about fear, it's about standing up for those who need it." Stefano's hands shook as Marco handed him a small package. Nothing more than a few carefully folded papers, but it felt like the weight of the world had been placed in his hands. "Deliver this to Don Cielo," Marco instructed. "Tell him Franco sent you. Don't let anyone stop you." At that moment, Stefano understood. The world he had been thrust into wasn't just about brute strength or fear. It was about loyalty, about alliances that stretched beyond simple friendships. He wasn't a passive observer anymore. He was part of something that required him to act, to take responsibility, to make choices. As Stefano made his way through the city to deliver the message, his mind raced. What had he become? Was he really part of this world now? He had no answers, only a deepening sense of responsibility. The streets felt different, darker. Every turn was a reminder that he was no longer a child protected by innocence, but a boy now marked by the actions he had taken and by the ones he would have to take in the future. When he returned, Franco was waiting for him, standing tall in his study. "You did well," Franco said, his voice steady but filled with a rare warmth. "You'll find your place here, Stefano. You'll see. It's not the power that matters. It's knowing who you stand with and who stands with you." And as Stefano nodded, he realized that he wasn't just following in Franco's shadow anymore. He was starting to carve out his own path, one that was fraught with danger but also filled with the protection and guidance of a world he hadn't chosen, but now in some strange way, had become part of. The schoolyard felt different the next day, emptier, somehow. The air was thick with an unspoken tension, a weight that pressed down on everyone as if they knew something had changed, but they couldn't quite place what. Stefano could feel it, even before he stepped through the gates. The whispers had started. The looks had turned colder. It was like the world had shifted around him, and he was no longer just the quiet boy, but something else. Something that made others wary, even scared. He didn't mind it, not really. But as he walked through the courtyard, his eyes found Maria, who sat on the swing, her legs kicking idly as she stared at the ground. The past few days had left her distant too, but it wasn't just the bullies who had changed things. It was what had followed. Inside the school, Principal Harris sat in his office, still shaken by the events of the past week. The weight of Franco's presence lingered like a cloud over him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the Godfather's words had more than just been a threat. They were a promise that now, finally, something would be done about the bullying. The power had shifted, and the students knew it. Dylan Marsh, who had once ruled the schoolyard with his gang of followers, felt the shift most acutely. The boy who had mocked Maria, who had taunted Stefano, was no longer the untouchable bully he once was. He had seen the motorcycles. He had seen the men in leather, their eyes cold, their intentions unreadable. He had seen the fear in his own father's eyes when he realized just who had come to collect. And now, as he sat in the principal's office, he could feel it, the weight of his actions crashing down on him. Franco's warning had been clear. If you do not correct this, I will. The implication had been chilling. There was no room for second chances, not with the kind of people who had just come to his school, but now, as he sat before Principal Harris and the teachers, he felt a gnawing fear deep inside him. It was fear of something worse than just punishment. It was fear of facing what he had done, of realizing just how small his cruelty had made him in the eyes of the world. The assembly was called just before the end of the school day. All the students were gathered in the gym. An uneasy quiet hanging in the air. When Franco entered, the room seemed to hold its breath. He wasn't here for a simple lecture or a reprimand. No, Franco was here for something far bigger. He was here to reshape this environment, to ensure that things like this never happened again. Stefano stood by the bleachers, feeling the weight of Franco's gaze on him. He knew what was coming. Franco had already told him what needed to be done. The Godfather's presence was undeniable, and now he was making sure that the bullies felt the full weight of their actions. Dylan Marsh, Franco's voice cut through the silence. And you too, Chris and Mike. Step forward. The three boys stood, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with tension. There were no defiant words, no bravado left. The fear was too real now. I've been patient, Franco continued, his voice calm but full of authority. But I've seen enough. You hurt a child who couldn't protect herself. You hurt a boy who stepped in when no one else would. That kind of behavior, that has consequences. He let the silence hang, his eyes sweeping across the room, locking onto each of the boys' faces. And those consequences aren't just about punishment. They're about learning to be better. Stefano watched from the sidelines as Franco's words sank in. There was no screaming, no violence. There was only the weight of accountability, and the realization that these boys were facing a reckoning far deeper than they had ever imagined. Franco nodded to Marco, who stepped forward, handing over a large envelope to the principal. It was a scholarship offer, funded by the very people who had come to this school to set things right. Stefano, Franco said, turning his gaze toward the boy. This is for you. Your courage deserves to be rewarded. The tension in the room shifted again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else. Something that spoke of redemption. Franco had not come to punish, but to restore balance, to remind everyone in that room that justice wasn't just about power. It was about standing up when it mattered, and doing what was right, even when it came at a cost. As the assembly ended, the students filed out in silence, their eyes now filled with a new understanding. The school had been reshaped, not by fear, but by accountability. And for Stefano, the boy who had only ever wanted to be left alone, the world felt a little different now, a little more just. Stefano had never imagined that loyalty could weigh so heavily. It wasn't something they taught you in school or on the playground. It wasn't in the books he read, or the quiet moments he spent sketching the world around him. No. Loyalty was something he was learning the hard way. Something that had a price far higher than anything he could have anticipated. It had been weeks since the showdown at the school. The whispers had faded, but the lessons hadn't. He was still the same boy, the same Stefano, but now, every day felt like a new chapter in a story he hadn't asked to be part of. Franco's presence was never far from him. Every step he took in this world came with the weight of expectation, and every time he thought he understood the game, the rules shifted. Franco had made it clear from the beginning, being part of his world wasn't about wealth or power. It was about loyalty, to him, to the family, to the code. It was an unspoken bond, stronger than any promise, any bloodline. But Stefano was beginning to understand what it really meant to live by that code. He spent more time with Franco, shadowing him during meetings with the other men, learning how to navigate the delicate balance of power and respect that governed everything. Franco didn't offer explanations or hand-holding. He showed Stefano by example. "You protect those who can't protect themselves," Franco would say, his voice always calm but never without an edge. "And you do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you're asked. Loyalty is earned, not given." But it wasn't just about standing up for others. It was about standing by them, even when it hurt, even when it meant making choices that didn't always make sense. Stefano saw it every day, in the quiet moments between the men, the ones that didn't involve threats or violence, but rather the kind of silent understanding that only comes when you know you've got someone's back no matter what. The first real test of his loyalty came when one of Franco's closest associates, Leo, found himself in trouble. A deal had gone sour, a rival gang had made a move, and now Leo was at risk of losing everything. Stefano watched as the tension mounted, as Franco's men gathered, each one looking to their leader for direction. Franco didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He made the call that would ensure Leo's protection, whether the cost was high or not. Stefano understood, even as he felt a pang of discomfort. The Mafia's world wasn't just about money or power. It was about knowing that if you were part of this, if you were family, there was nothing you wouldn't do for each other. The price of loyalty was sacrifice. It wasn't always fair, and it wasn't always pretty, but it was always necessary. As Franco's men worked to deal with the fallout from the botched deal, Stefano sat in the corner of the room, absorbing everything. He had seen how power moved in the shadows, how it could be wielded with a single word or a subtle glance. But he had also seen the price of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a debt, one that had to be repaid in loyalty, in action. Later that evening, Franco pulled Stefano aside. "You've been watching, I know," he said, his eyes hard but not unkind. "This is how it works. You stand by those who stand by you. Loyalty is everything. And if you ever forget that, you'll lose everything." Stefano nodded, the weight of those words settling deep in his chest. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He wasn't the quiet kid with his head in his books. He was part of something bigger now, a world where loyalty and power walked hand in hand, and where standing up for others wasn't just a choice. It was the price of belonging. And Stefano had learned the cost, just as he had learned the value. The world outside Franco's mansion felt like a distant memory to Stefano. The schoolyard, the familiar streets, even the quiet corners where he had once spent hours sketching the world around him, they all seemed far away now, swallowed by the weight of the life he had stepped into. Each day felt like another step into a deeper, darker world, one where there were no easy answers and no way back to the life he had known. But despite the unease, despite the fear that lingered in the back of his mind, Stefano was beginning to understand. He was beginning to find his place. Franco had not treated him like a child. From the moment he had entered his world, Stefano was expected to act, to learn, to grow. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. Every lesson he absorbed came with a price: trust, loyalty, protection, and each lesson had consequences. There were no second chances in this world. It was as simple and as brutal as that. As Stefano spent more time with Franco, he began to see the complexity of the life the Godfather led. The men who worked for Franco weren't just followers, they were family. They had each other's backs, no matter the cost. It was a bond that transcended business, transcended the streets. They stood together and they fought together. Stefano had already learned that loyalty was everything, but it was only now, after months of living in Franco's world, that he was starting to feel the weight of that loyalty pressed down on him. It wasn't a choice anymore. It was a responsibility. One evening, as they sat in the study, Franco turned to Stefano, his expression unreadable. "You've done well so far," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his expectations. "But this world isn't for everyone. It takes strength, Stefano. Not just in your hands, but in your heart. Can you handle that?" Stefano looked up at Franco, the Godfather who had taken him in, who had shown him what it meant to stand up for those who couldn't protect themselves. He thought about the decisions he had made, the paths he had walked, and the paths still ahead of him. The world Franco had introduced him to was unforgiving, but it was also a world where, for the first time, Stefano felt like he belonged. He had a purpose, a role to play. "Yes," Stefano said, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. "I understand." And he did. He understood that the boy he had been was gone. There was no more room for the quiet, unnoticed child. The boy who had stepped in to protect Maria was now a part of something much larger, a world where power and loyalty went hand in hand, where protection came with sacrifices. He was no longer a bystander. He was part of the family now. The days turned into weeks, and Stefano's understanding of the Mafia's world deepened. He learned the intricacies of the business, the delicate dance between power, loyalty, and control. Franco didn't just teach him how to be part of this world. He showed him how to navigate it, how to stand tall, how to think ahead, how to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. As Stefano looked out the window of Franco's mansion, watching the city stretch out beneath him, he knew that his future was no longer his own. It belonged to the Mafia now, to the loyalty that bound him to Franco and the family. But it also belonged to something greater, something more powerful. The realization that he had the strength, the courage, and the loyalty to shape that future. And with that knowledge, Stefano finally understood his new role in the world. It was one he would not back away from, no matter the cost.